In 1774, a 24-year-old German writer published a short novel. It was a love story. The hero falls for a woman he can't have. He suffers. He writes letters about his suffering, and in the final pages, he shoots himself. The book became the biggest literary sensation in European history. And then people started dying. Young men across Europe dressed in the same clothes as the protagonist, using the same method, leaving the same kind of letters. The governments of several countries banned the book, not because it was badly written, because it was killing its readers. What Goethe accidentally discovered in 1774, and what sociologist David Phillips formally documented 200 years later, is one of the most disturbing and least discussed phenomena in all of behavioral science. Human behavior is contagious, not metaphorically, not in the motivational speaker sense of surround yourself with good people. Literally contagious, like a pathogen, with transmission patterns, incubation periods, and a predictable spread. By the end of this video, you will understand the mechanism, and you will never consume media the same way again. Goethe's novel and Phillips' discovery. The novel was called The Sorrows of Young Werther. Goethe wrote it in 4 weeks, drawing partly from his own experience of unrequited love. The protagonist, Werther, is sensitive, romantic, intelligent. Readers across Europe identified with him completely. When Werther died by suicide in the final pages, something unprecedented happened. Reports began coming in from across the continent. Young men, the same demographic as Werther, were dying in the same way, wearing the same yellow waistcoat and blue coat that Goethe had described on his protagonist. Some left behind copies of the novel, open to the final pages. No one had a framework for what was happening. The authorities responded by banning the book in several countries, including Denmark, Italy, and parts of Germany. The phenomenon was noted, discussed, and then largely forgotten by mainstream science for almost 2 centuries. In 1974, exactly 200 years later, a sociologist at the University of California named David Phillips was going through newspaper archives and national mortality data. He was looking for a pattern. What he found quietly changed everything we thought we knew about human behavior. Phillips took every front-page suicide story published in major U.S. newspapers between 1947 and 1968. He then looked at the national suicide statistics in the days and weeks following each story. The pattern was unambiguous. After every major front-page suicide story, the national suicide rate increased, not by a small margin, by an average of 58 additional deaths in the month following the story. The more prominent the coverage, the larger the spike. The spike was geographically concentrated in the areas where the newspaper had highest circulation. And, critically, the demographics of the deaths matched the demographics of the person covered. A story about a young woman was followed by an increase in deaths among young women. A story about an older man was followed by an increase in deaths among older men. Phillips called it the Werther Effect. And then he asked the question that made his research genuinely unsettling. If this happens with suicide, what else does it happen with? Imitation as a biological mechanism. The answer, it turns out, is almost everything. Phillips went on to study traffic fatalities following front-page suicide stories. They increased too, concentrated in the same geographic areas, matching the same demographics. He studied plane crashes, controlled for weather, mechanical failure, pilot error. After high-profile murder-suicides in the news, fatal single-occupant plane crashes increased by over 1,000%. Something was transmitting. And it wasn't information. Because the people who died in those car crashes and plane crashes were not consciously copying anything. To understand the mechanism, you need to understand what neuroscientists discovered in the 1990s entirely by accident. A research team in Parma, Italy, was studying motor neurons in macaque monkeys. They had implanted electrodes to measure when specific neurons fired during voluntary movement. One day, a researcher reached for a peanut. A neuron in the monkey's brain fired, the same neuron that fired when the monkey itself reached for food. The monkey hadn't moved, it had only watched. These became known as mirror neurons, and while the science around their specific role in human cognition is still being refined, the broader phenomenon they point to is now well established. The human brain doesn't sharply distinguish between performing an action and observing one. When you watch someone experience something, joy, pain, fear, grief, your brain activates many of the same neural circuits as if you were experiencing it yourself. This is why you flinch when someone else stubs their toe, why you yawn when someone near you yawns, why fictional characters can make you cry even though you know they aren't real. The boundary between self and other is much more permeable than we intuitively believe. And this permeability, which is the foundation of empathy, of learning, of culture itself, is also the mechanism through which behavior spreads. What Goethe's readers experienced in 1774 wasn't weakness. It wasn't pathology. It was the normal operating system of the human brain, encountering a story powerful enough to activate it fully. Where you experience this without knowing. The Werther Effect is not a historical curiosity. It is active right now, in every piece of media you consume, every story you follow, every life you observe. Consider what happens when a celebrity you admire publicly quits a career, moves to a different country, walks away from a relationship. Within weeks, people in your social circle start talking about quitting their jobs, moving away, reassessing their relationships. Nobody copies consciously. Nobody sits down and says, I will do what they did. But the template was placed in the environment, and the brain, which is always asking, what do people like me do in situations like this? Found an answer. This is why mass resignation events happen in waves, why certain relationship dynamics suddenly become visible everywhere after a cultural moment names them, why fashion, language, and lifestyle choices spread through social networks in patterns that look almost identical to the spread of infectious disease, because they follow the same underlying logic. But here is the part that matters most for how you think about your own life. The Werther Effect has a mirror image. In 1986, Phillips documented what he called the Papageno Effect, named after a character in Mozart's The Magic Flute, who was talked out of suicide by a story of hope and alternative. Studies on media reporting of suicide showed that stories covering how people navigated crisis, found meaning, chose to continue, were followed by decreases in suicide rates. The contagion worked in both directions. Despair spread through stories of despair. Resilience spread through stories of resilience. The stories you consume are not neutral entertainment. They are behavioral templates your brain files away for use in moments of pressure, confusion, or crisis. Goethe lived to be 82. He outlived the scandal, the bans, the deaths, and for the rest of his life he was deeply ambivalent about the book that made him famous. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that he had not simply told a story. He had released something into the world, something that traveled from mind to mind through the mechanism of identification, of recognition, of, this is someone like me, in a situation like mine. The question this leaves isn't whether stories are dangerous. Stories are the primary way human beings transmit experience, values, and ways of being across time and between people. That's not a bug. That's what stories are for. The question is, which templates are you absorbing? Whose life is your brain quietly running as a reference point for what's possible, what's normal, what someone like you does when things get hard, because you are choosing, whether you know it or not. Subscribe to PsyLens if you want to keep making that choice consciously. I'll see you there.